So you want you were going to say anything, or is it all over to me?
Well, I'm going to introduce you. So,
yeah.
Allister Ashmead, welcome to St. Paul, Minnesota. We're very excited to talk to you about your wines and your winery and your family and anything else that may come up and taste these great wines. The first question I want to ask is, when is it there?
What time?
When is it?
What time and what day is it?
It's 9 o'clock in the morning, Friday. So I'm close to the weekend.
That's what I thought. So I have it's just a fun coincidence. About an hour ago, a young couple came in and they said they were hoping to buy a bottle of Shiraz. And I showed them a few things that we had. And they said, well, this is for a 50th birthday. So we want something really special. So they went home with a bottle of this Command Shiraz that we're getting ready to taste. And I told them that later on this evening, I would send them a recording of a conversation with the owner of the winery. So that's a pretty amazing and fun coincidence that someone came in 1 hour ago looking for exactly this wine. I think I muted you by mistake. So Allister, if you'd unmute yourself.
All right, that's probably better. You can probably hear me now.
So I think the first thing, tell us what makes Barossa so special.
So the Barossa is a remarkable community. And that's probably its strongest thing, is the fact that everyone here gets along and helps lift the load, and has a pretty remarkable history as well. So the Barossa itself was first settled. So just in terms of a geography lesson first, I guess, we're in the state of South Australia. So if you can imagine sort of the picture of Australia, we're in the middle of the country, but down south, about an hour inland from the coast. If anyone has been to Australia, Adelaide is our capital city, which is about 50 miles away. But the Barossa itself is one of Australia's oldest wine growing regions. It was first settled by Germans who were fleeing religious persecution in their own part of Germany. An English guy by the name of George Fife Angus actually gave them a rite of passage, sold some land to them once they got to Australia, and because even here in 2021, we are still quite remote. But vineyards went in the early 1840s, and this was just a concept of being self-sustainable. So those early settlers here in the Barossa, if they wanted to eat anything, if they wanted to drink anything, they really had to.
Allister, we've lost your audio.
Okay.
There you are, you're back now.
Yeah, cool. Hopefully
we didn't hear some of what you just said.
Yeah, okay. So mostly I was sort of talking about the history and the fact that vines were planted in the Barossa in 1842 or 1843, thereabouts. That it all came about from self-sustainability, and the concept was that if you wanted to eat or drink anything, you had to make it yourself. And over the next 130 or so years, the Barossa developed this great reputation for fortified wines, and the reason for that was due to pretty prehistoric winemaking technology, and it was really the only way that Barossa winemakers could get wines to market in Melbourne or in Sydney or in Brisbane or even over in the UK in London. Get wines in market that would remain stable and good to drink. And that really set up the Barossa as a pretty big powerhouse. But of course, it all came crashing down in the mid-1970s when we first started to witness this huge shift in global consumption, and people stopped putting vintage ports on the dinner table, and instead started to put Burgundies and Bordeaux's and all sorts of things. Napa Cabernet in Australia, Victorian wines became popular, but it was all table wine. It wasn't fortified, and so the Barossa went through a 10-year, really dark period of pain and suffering, where locally this time in our history is called the vine pull era, because that's what grape growers were doing. Over half of the Barossa's vineyards in this 10-year period were bulldozed out of existence. The government of South Australia was paying growers to pull out 100-year-old vines, which today are obviously so very cherished by winemakers here in the Barossa and make other winemakers around the world very envious. But the third thing is that the head of Roseworthy, which Roseworthy's the best winemaking school here in Australia, so the equivalent of UC Davis probably in the United States. He was telling his students in the mid 1970s to not take jobs in the Barossa because under his thinking, the Barossa would not exist by the year 2000. So it shows really how tough that period was, but also it shows how remarkable the Barossa is as a community, that we banded together. We promoted the Barossa, we've regenerated, and today the Barossa sits as the jewel in the crown of Australian winemaking.
I would encourage everyone to pour themselves a glass of the Chardonnay as we get started here. Those vines that were pulled up in the mid 70s, what grapes were those? Were those Cabernet and Shiraz, or was it port grapes like Touriga Nacional?
So really, a lot of those Portuguese port grapes were never really planted here, and not probably till more recently. But largely all of those Australian fortifieds were made from Grenache, Shiraz, and Mataro, as we call it, or Mourvèdre, basically. So in essence, I think a lot of the old Grenache came out first, but there was lots and lots of old Shiraz that was pulled out. And it was only about 10 years ago that the Barossa got back to that original level of planting, basically. But I have a good mate who makes wine down the road. We went to college together, and I've known him forever. And I was at his house, and his mum told me that they pulled out 120-year-old Shiraz in the late 1970s. So that would make it 170-year-old Shiraz now, 160-year-old Shiraz. And I just said, I don't understand. Why did you do it? And she went and actually got her financial records from that era, and she showed me that this 120-year-old Shiraz was cropping at a ton per acre. They were getting paid $120 a ton for it, and today that fruit would be worth well over $15,000 or $20,000 a ton. It was costing them $80 a ton just to pick it, and on top of that, the winery that was offering them that said that we're not even going to give you cash. You have to take your proceeds out in stock. So along comes the government and gives you a check to pull out the vines. That's why so many were pulled out, unfortunately. But there was a great group of men and women and families who understood how great these vines were, and this is where my family sort of starts to enter the story, that really started to promote and protect these things. So I have that belief that it's like your little finger. You don't realize how valuable it is until you put a little cut in it or something like that. You've got to realize what you're losing before you actually understand it sometimes. And that was that process of turning the Barossa around.
So your friend's mother, they were grossing $120 an acre.
Yeah, exactly. And they had to take it out.
$80 an acre to pick the grape.
Yeah, exactly. So they were tough times, but it's that resilience of this community and being a very Germanic community. Initially, obviously, last century there was a lot of turmoil in the Barossa, but all those events have just made the place sing as one group, basically. And every producer here understands and knows that whilst Elderton is important, the most important thing for people to understand, and especially over in your part of the world, is that the Barossa makes some really good Shiraz, and you can trust it.
You know, it reminds me a little bit of the saga of Zinfandel in California, that
Definitely.
it's a little different. Zinfandel, you know, people were pulling up vines because phylloxera was killing them, and then replanting with roots that were resistant to phylloxera, but the Zinfandel vines were, on original rootstocks that were resistant to phylloxera. The Zinfandel didn't have to be replanted. And so you have these 150-year-old Zinfandel vines that make, that Ridge has and people like that make such extraordinary wines. And it's just resilience, that creates that.
Yeah, I think, we talk about our old vines that they are good because they're old, but the reality is they're old because they're good. And as I get older, I certainly become more and more understanding that not everything lives to be 100 years old, but only the great vineyards survive. But when you also consider that there's economics that's behind it, there's fashion that's behind it, there's politics that are behind whether vineyards stay in, and obviously that's where a lot of those old Zinfandel vines really suffered, is they fell out of popularity as people moved towards Cabernet, etc. But those old vines in California, and from Paso right up to Sonoma, basically, they're amazing. I'm a big fan.
You worked, I know it says on your website that you spent some time working abroad. Did you work in California?
I did. I worked 1998 vintage or harvest at St. Superi in the Napa, and that was actually under a Barossa winemaker who are good friends of our family, the Scholzes, who own a little winery here in the Barossa called Willows. And Michael Scholz basically found me working for Treasury Wine Estates as a cellar hand as I just finished my commerce degree, and said, "How would you like to come over to America?" And I was like, "You betcha," basically. Yeah, I had an awesome time in Napa, and it was a real awakening for me, I guess, growing up and quite sheltered in the Barossa and thinking that there was probably only 5 or 6 grape varieties in the world. The Napa really, really opened my mind, and also showed me that there's more than one way to make great wine.
You say Shiraz?
I do say Shiraz.
Not Shiraz.
No, I say Shiraz. It varies all over Australia. Again, it's harder to pick Australian accents than it is American accents, but there are certainly very subtle differences. And Kat, you'd probably agree that when you have the Tyrrells in town from Hunter, they actually say Shiraz. They don't even pronounce the Z whatsoever. But Shiraz is fine as long as you're drinking it.
I had lunch quite a while ago with Peter Gago.
Yes.
Who he may still make Grange, but at that time
he does. He does.
Gosh,
I did a tasting with him on Friday.
Really? He must be older than I am. How old is he?
I was only trying to work that out. I think he'd be early 60s at a guess.
Oh, so we're about.
But he's been in that job for a while.
Yeah, so I'm older than he is, but I had a background mostly in French wines, French restaurants, and anyway, I had lunch with him, and I said something about the Grange Hermitage because back before they had to change the name, and he said, "Wait, we speak English in Australia. This wine is called Grange Hermitage, not Grange Hermitage."
Yeah,
But
exactly.
and then he corrected my pronunciation of Shiraz also. He said, we call it Shiraz, not Shiraz. So that's a long time ago, and I remember it so clearly that
I don't know whether you can see this, but that is me telling Peter Gago what he's doing wrong at the McGill Cellars last Friday.
Wow. How did he react to your telling him what he was doing wrong?
No, I was actually praising him. Again, I have the utmost respect for Penfolds. Yeah. I think our wines show distinct differences to what theirs do, and we we often say we're the second biggest winery in Europe because Penfolds are our next door neighbours. But in comparison, we make about as much wine as what those guys spill on the ground every year. But Penfolds have opened so many doors for little family producers like us. They've made great wines forever. They continue to. I tried the 16 Grange with Peter on Friday, and it's a cracker. It's not expensive, but it's a cracker.
I had the 13 at lunch about a year ago, and it was amazing.
Yeah, nice.
But I think the first vintage was the 51. Is that right?
I think you're right. The experimental one, which there's very, very, very few bottles left, and they sell for tens of thousands, if not into the hundreds of thousands now.
I tasted that, I don't know, probably 15 years ago, and it was still amazing.
Wow.
Mature, but amazing. So talk to us about the Chardonnay, the E series on oak Chardonnay that we're tasting.
So E series for us is our entry level beginning to winemaking, food and fun friendly white wine, and there is a Shiraz Cabernet that goes alongside it. We make this wine, the other the Shiraz Cabernet blend. We don't actually grow all the fruit ourselves for it. Sometimes some of our estate fruit goes into it, but this is about making a wine just to put a smile on people's faces. The important thing about these wines for us, though, is that they're wines that we actually do take home and do like to drink. I've learned twice in my life, in my 22-year time here at Elderton as the second generation of the family business, that you need to make wines that you like to drink. Because if you make wines that you don't like to drink and you can't sell them, you actually have to drink them. And that's not a lot of fun. And so it's important to us that with these wines, they're in balance, they're fruit forward, and they're classically driven styles that are just simply delicious. And for this E-Series Chardonnay, this comes from a mate of mine's property, mostly a guy called Ashley Ratcliffe, who's sort of the king of the Riverland, who's got a farm called Ricatera, and he's doing some amazing things there. The Chardonnay is unoaked, and it is just fit to bring home, put in the fridge, crack the Stelvin casing off the top, and just love it for its sort of peachy and deliciousness, basically. I often call this wine, and certainly when I do wine dinners with this wine, I talk about this wine being the perfect AA wine. And by AA, sometimes it does mean Allister Ashmead, but the reality of this wine is it's purely here for attitude adjustment. So the concept, as I said, is you have it cold in the fridge, you come home after a hard day's work or after a hard week's work, you pour yourself a glass, you drink it, you pour yourself another glass and you start to drink it, and you slowly change your attitude about how tough and how bad life can be. And it's not a wine that we expect people to talk about the intricacies and all that craziness for a whole lot, but just drink it because it's priced for liberal consumption and it's pretty yummy.
I think it's a really good value too for the price. It's in my opinion, it's just a great value.
Why did you choose to make? Why is unoaked? Because when we think of Australian Chardonnay, you tend to think of wines like Lewin Estates and wines like that are amazing, but pretty, So
when we started this project, Chardonnay was very much out of fashion, and even still today, like whilst Australia is making some of the most remarkable, and even at the high end, which is nowhere near where Burgundy is headed. I mean, the value in Australian Chardonnay right across the board is absolutely remarkable, and there's some amazing wines being made. But when we started this project, Chardonnay was way out of favour. We'd come from the 1980s and 1990s, where Chardonnays were all super big and super rich and full malos and plenty of oak. They were dark yellow in colour, and I mean, I call them sort of Wall Street wines because they're all about power and richness. And Chardonnay fell out of favor. People just got sick of drinking this style of Chardonnay, and unoaked Chardonnay became something super popular here in Australia, and especially with our Mediterranean climate, the beautiful beaches and the warm sunshine. It was a concept of looking for simplicity over complexity in Chardonnay. And so we actually do make an oak Chardonnay as well, but we mostly make that for my wife, who loves oak Chardonnay, and it comes from an estate vineyard that we grow. But in this case, it's purely about simplicity.
And doesn't in your opinion, unoaked Chardonnay is a better food wine than heavily oaked Chard, or?
Depends on it depends on what you're eating. I mean, both have their favors, and if anything, now if you look at the concept of high-end Australian Chardonnay, it's actually come too far. It had gone too far the other way, where all these wines had no color. They smelt like a struck match, and didn't have a whole lot of flavor. And I think the balance is actually coming back now, where there's a little bit of richness and ripening. The very, very high-end ones obviously have small touches of very good quality oak. But in terms of this, I mean, it's that chameleon wine that I agree completely with you, Kat. You can drink it on just as an aperitif. You can drink it with fresh seafood. You can drink it with Asian food. You can drink it with whatever you want, really. It'll pretty much work.
I really think your comment that it's perfect to just having the refrigerator and you get home and at the end of a long day and pour yourself a glass. I mean, I don't really generally like white wines all that cold, but I think this wine, cold and fresh and crisp and bracing, is just, kind of what you need at the end of end of the day, while you're fixing dinner or something, while you're cooking something to go with the Shiraz later.
And as Kat pointed out, it doesn't break the bank. So it's a perfect weekday wine if that's what's required.
In one of these conversations that we've had so many, I don't remember which winemaker it was, but one of the famous winemakers we talked to said his epiphany wine was Lewin Estate Artist Series Chardonnay. That's when he knew he wanted to be a winemaker, was when he tasted that wine with, I think it was the winemaker at Lewin Estate.
It's certainly it's also the wine that got my wife onto Chardonnay. So we went across to Margaret River for a wedding, and we're sitting on the deck. Lewin has a great little restaurant. You sit out and look over the trees and the gardens. And I ordered an old bottle of Lewin Chardonnay, and my wife, who was then my girlfriend, looked at me and said, "What are you doing? Like, we don't really drink Chardonnay, and we certainly don't drink old Chardonnay." And I just said, "Look at this. We'll just wait and see what happens." And I think that was the beginning of her love affair with Chardonnay, basically. And that's the other thing with this wine is, we don't recommend cellaring it, but I've seen old bottles of this that look really remarkable. And Kat, you've probably seen a few as well.
I think that's a lot of people think that Chardonnay does not age well, and it does. Even that's an oak Chardonnay, I find them to be. I like them with a couple of years age on them, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. Well, before we get into the estate, would you mention to the people who have joined us how many vineyards you have, acreage, and how many cases? Because I think a lot of people think, Australia, big wineries, and I think Elderton, in my opinion, is a boutique winery. Anything that's under 50,000, 60,000 cases is small. And so, how many vines are planted? How many acres do you have?
So we own 3 vineyards across the breadth of the Barossa. So my parents accidentally bought a vineyard in the middle of the township of Nuriootpa in 1980, and by accidentally, they weren't grape growers, they weren't winemakers, they weren't even from the Barossa. We moved here because we had been living the expat lifestyle. Mum and Dad worked in Saudi Arabia. Dad worked in Saudi Arabia for a year and a half. Got sick of living in Saudi, wanted to come home. Dad got a job with Caterpillar Tractors because he was civil engineer in Adelaide, and through my grandfather, who had good mates up the road from us here at Yalumba, they found and fell in love with this beautiful house that I'm sitting in right now today. It's actually our tasting room today. And this is the middle of those tough times I was mentioning before. And the family that had built the house had abandoned it 3 years earlier. The vineyard had been on the market for 3 or 4 years. No one had lived in the house, and the real estate agent was pretty happy to see mum and dad, because he'd been trying to sell this place for 3 or 4 years. And he pretty much said, if you buy the house, I'm going to give you the vineyard for nothing. And today, of course, 40 years down the track, you'd get the house for free if you bought the vineyard, but we are not for sale. But so this is the real pride and joy of Elderton. It's a 72-acre vineyard which has vines planted back to 1894. We then, in 2007, purchased a vineyard up in the Eden Valley. So it's the Barossa's beautiful high country, and it's the eastern hillside of the Barossa, basically, where soils and temperatures range completely different to what we're looking at here on the valley floor. We have 40 acres up there. And then in 2010, we purchased a vineyard on the western hillside of the Barossa, just north of a little hamlet of a town called Greenock. And there's about 50 acres up there. And in a normal year, Elderton sits between sort of 30 and 40,000 cases. So we probably have classified ourselves as a sort of commercial boutique in terms of size. But after going through 2 very, very, very small vintages in 2019 and 2020, we kind of classify ourselves as a non-commercial boutique winery at the moment. But 2021 has changed that. So we've been through harvest, we've finished, and 2021 we've got great quality, and we've finally got some quantity in the tanks and barrels again. So we're smiling again.
And the drought is completely over, or
the Barossa's has constant issues with rainfall. It has ever since we've pretty much arrived here, and did before that. We had good rains last year, and the soils look pretty good even after a mild summer that we've just been through. But again, it's time for it to rain, so I can't comment until it rains again. And it's supposed to rain a little bit next week, but we had really ideal conditions through the year, so we can't complain.
And you just finished harvest, correct?
We finished about 3 weeks ago. So obviously everything's flipped down here. We start picking in February or March, and go through till late April or start of May.
Allister, Kat mentioned the subject of drought. Global climate change comes up in almost every one of these conversations, and it's either a 30-second or a 5-minute conversation or segment of the conversation. But it occurred to me in thinking about this talk with you today that really someone in the Barossa that's who we should be talking to about the effects of global climate change on wine and on growing grapes and making wine. Because my impression is, I'm not there, but my impression is that the effect of global climate change has been more severe in the Barossa than anywhere, really. Was it 2013 that the horrible fires happened? Was that?
So there's been, Australia is a land of obviously droughts and floods and fires, and actually our native forests require bushfires to regenerate, basically. So it's a thing that's been going on for centuries here in Australia. I stupidly opened my mouth about 5 years ago and said I've lived in the Barossa for 30 years, and how remarkable it is that we haven't had a bushfire in any of those 30 years of my existence here. And then 2 years later, we'd had 3. So the last one we had was the end of 2015. So affecting, or theoretically affecting, the 2016 harvest. We had a vineyard that got within the fires got within a couple of miles of that vineyard. But we didn't make Grenaches that year. But apart from that, we sailed through, basically. But if you look at the world right now, and of course you guys being lovers of California and my love of Napa and California, it's heartbreaking to see that Napa has burnt 4 years in a row. But there's hardly a spot that probably hasn't been affected by fires. And this is a concept that, I mean, we all need to think about. I'm not sure whether the Barossa is going to be the most harshly dealt with. I think we have the tools to deal with climate change. We've probably had a head start on it.
Yeah.
In that we've realised that water is a very scarce resource here a lot earlier than everyone else. But I did a masterclass on Cabernet in Hong Kong 18 months ago, and there were 8 winemakers from 6 winemaking countries, Northern and Southern Hemisphere, Bordeaux and Napa and Chile and Argentina and Australia and New Zealand and somewhere else. And all 8 winemakers, unprompted, got up and said, we do not have enough access to water for what we want to do with our vineyards, basically. And that's a pretty scary thing. And like for us, I think that's probably been the hardest thing to work out is and I think the whole world is over-farmed for too long, but it's actually working out the resource that we have and using it sustainably. And so when my parents first arrived here in the Barossa, water was just thought of being never ending, basically, and was used accordingly. And today we understand how precious it is and look after it as much as we can.
Joel Peterson, who owned Ravenswood for a long time and then sold it and has started a new winery called Once and Future Wines, and along with Paul Draper, is greatly responsible for the idea of high quality single vineyards, Zinfandel in California.
Yep.
Talked about the impact. Well, I guess you know who Joel Peterson is, but I don't want to assume that.
No, I do, and I've met Paul Draper as well. They're rock stars. Paul Draper is probably the only wine superstar that has made me lose my tongue. I had no idea what to say to him. Such is my affection for he and his wines.
Was that Paul or Joel?
Paul.
Oh.
But Joel as well. I remember, Ravenswood were some of my early favourites.
Well, in the conversation, one of these conversations with him, he talked about just the reality of fires and that he and his peers in California, well, he didn't really have peers, but he and his other, people growing grapes in California, it's incumbent upon them to plan for this, because there are fires, as you said, 4 years in a row. It's not once every 4 years now, it's 4 years in a row. And he said 3 out of 4 years we're going to have fires. We have to be able to deal with them, or we're not going to be able to survive as winemakers.
No,
and then, and what do you do when there are fires? What do you do with smoke taint? What do you do to protect your buildings and your vineyards and everything else? So I agree with you about Paul. He's a good friend, but he is a very, you just feel like you need to genuflect when he walks in the room, because the world would be a different place if he hadn't come along and decided.
He's obviously nothing but pleasant and remarkable and unassuming. But when I discovered I was standing right next to him, I just went completely blank.
I sat next to him at a vertical tasting of Mouton Rothschild one time in a large room of a lot of people. I just, by chance, he sat down next to me, and I learned a lot more listening to Paul talk under his breath about Mouton than I did listening to Philippine de Rothschild talk about Mouton. So he was firmly convinced the 82 Mouton is a flawed wine and undrinkable, which of course is one of the greatest wines ever made. But that's Paul.
Exactly.
We're going to do the Elderton Estate Cabernet next.
Right.
It's actually a good segue talking about Paul, because if those of you have the bottle of Cabernet in front of you, if you turn it around to the back label and you see vineyard source, vine age, picking dates, all of that was actually inspired by the Ridge label of telling you exactly what's in the bottle, basically. And I love that full disclosure that Ridge has always had in terms of saying, well, it's 1% Carignan and 77% Zinfandel, and and blah, blah, blah. And so this is probably our little homage to, I guess, that their wine company, to say, well, we're going to tell everyone exactly and the truth of what's in it. So Cabernet for us is something that's very, very close to our hearts. Again, most people would not naturally assume that the Barossa, which is so famous for Shiraz, can also do some very good Cabernet. We have Cabernet vines on our New vineyard that we believe are about 80 years old. So some of the oldest Cabernet vines that exist anywhere on the planet. And funnily enough, the Barossa does own the oldest Cabernet vineyard on the planet. It's a block planted in the 1880s. It's part of the Penfold stable, but it is a remarkable vineyard. So Cabernet for us was probably the wine that got Elderton really started. So Mum and Dad started making wine in 1982 with the help of a local Barossa legend, a guy called Peter Lehman, who has sadly passed in the last 4 or 5 years. Peter couldn't buy our fruit like we wanted to because he was trying to save so many growers he'd worked with for a long, long time, but said, listen, if you want to make some wine, I'll help you make some wine. And so that's how Elderton began in 1982. Obviously, as we said before, we've just finished harvest this year, which is the end of the Ashmead's 40th harvest here at Elderton, which we're immensely proud of, basically. But Mum and Dad toiled away in the early 80s, swimming very much against the tide, trying to get people interested in dry red wines from the Barossa. They started to get some traction in the late 80s, and I think probably the same thing happened in the US, that Australia went into a pretty harsh recession in the late 80s that again put Mum and Dad on the bones of their backside. I think we were about to probably check out of the wine industry in the early 90s through this recession and tough times. And we were lucky enough to win an award called the Jimmy Watson Trophy, which is an award given to a 1-year-old red wine at the Melbourne Wine Show. So it's quite controversial that it's awarded to a very, very young wine, but it was never supposed to be the biggest accolade in Australian winemaking. It was just that a young man by the name of Wolf Blass won it 3 years in a row in the mid 70s and promoted the hell out of it. And it has become sort of the most famous accolade. And we were lucky enough to win it in 1993 for our 1992 Cabernet, which forever set us on a path of being relevant and being remarkable in terms of Cabernet. And there isn't a lot of Cabernet left in the Barossa, which I think is a bit sad, but at the same time, it's a great opportunity because the Barossa is very much a grower-led community. So there are 700 independent grape growing families or thereabouts whose only responsibility in the Barossa is to grow good grapes. And then they sell those grapes to the 100 to 200 wineries, depending on your definition, to turn them into wine. And so when the Barossa is so powerful with Shiraz, and Shiraz is going ahead in leaps and bounds, and the winemakers are coming to you as a grower and saying, I'll pay you $500 more a tonne for Shiraz. And then you think about it as a grower and go, well, Shiraz is easier to grow. The plants live longer. They yield higher. And the winemaker is going to pay me more money. There's been a whole lot of Cabernet in the last decade or so that's been pulled out of the ground. As I was saying, the opportunity in this, though, is you're actually left with the real champions, the real people who actually believe in the variety and know how to do it well. And I think for me personally as a drinker, I actually look for those wines. I look for the wines that aren't always the most popular. I look for the ones that are the heart and soul wines, the ones that the winemakers truly love, because they've got to work, well, we have to work extra hard to get noticed with these things. And everyone brings up the sideways thing and says, well, that killed Merlot in the United States. But the reality was, in my opinion, winemakers killed Merlot a long time before that because it became too easy to sell. There was not a lot of energy or effort put into Merlot, and there was a whole lot of rubbish wines on the market. It was just that movie picked up on that and was probably the last nail in the coffin almost. So Cabernet for us, as I said, it's near and dear to our heart. This wine in front of you is the descendant of that wine that won the Jimmy Watson almost 30 years ago, 26 vintages ago. It's fully estate grown across the 3 vineyards that we own. And I guess one of my favorite stories of showcasing this wine in America over the 20 or so years that I've been coming to your beautiful country was I was in Denver about 2 or 3 years ago in the best steakhouse in town, apparently the #1 Somm, and I showed him that Cabernet. I think it was obviously a few years earlier, and I think you guys are looking at the 2018 tonight. And he just put it in his glass, he sipped it, he stood up and just went, wow. He said, he looked at me and he went, winemakers in Napa wish they could make wines as good as that at that price. And I looked at him with a bit of a cheeky grin and said, I actually don't think you could be more wrong. And he sort of said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, I probably wish I was getting the prices that they get. And he thought that was immensely funny. But I love the fact that the Barossa retains this humbleness to it. Obviously, land is cheaper, life is cheaper here in the Barossa. We don't require as much money for these wines, but it's just a great entree into what the best of the Barossa is. And this would sit, I don't know, somewhere around $30, I imagine, on shelf. It is a whole big glass of wine for $30, in my opinion. I'm completely biased and I admit it, but hopefully there's a few people shaking their heads going, yeah, I think so.
Well, it always gets great press, and it's a wine that I think this vintage, if anybody's in the scores, I think personally scores help us sell the wine, but it's whether you like the wine or not, that's what counts. But this was, I think, 93 points, and this is a wine that you can cellar for quite a few years. And I really wanted to show Cabernet as well, so that's why instead I could have done Elderton. There's an estate Shiraz too that's just killer, but I really wanted to show the Cabernet because you don't get a lot of Cabernet coming from Australia.
Allister, we sell this. Our price for this wine is $23.
That's, yeah, isn't that amazing? To think that it's got fruit that is from vineyards up to 75 years old, that it's won Australia's biggest wine accolade from a family that have been making wine for 40 years.
Wait, he's going to raise the price to us now. You should never have mentioned that.
Well, I think the Australian dollar's doing that for me anyway, but unfortunately we don't see that either. But yeah, I think that 2018 is one of the best Cabernets we've ever made.
You know, we had one of these conversations with Laura Catena from Catena Zapata, and she said that one of the things her father instituted was once a year they taste their wines in comparison to their competitors' wines that sell for 2 or 3 times as much. And her father's philosophy is that their wines need to be as good or better than their competitors' wines that sell for 2 or 3 times as much, because if they are, then they don't have to spend any money on marketing. The wines will market themselves because of the quality in the bottle. And you know, if you in the world of Cabernet Sauvignon, $23. I mean, there really isn't any Napa Cabernet that sells for $23.
No, exactly.
This wine for me is perfect on have a ribeye steak in the summertime, hot off the grill with a glass of Elderton Cabernet.
Yeah,
I mean, this is a fantastic wine.
It's a similar story here.
Fantastic wine, and then it happens to only be $23. There's a distinction between fantastic $23 bottle of wine and a fantastic wine that's $23. Those are 2 different things. This is a fantastic wine that happens to be really affordable.
If I can go a little bit back in our history again, the year that we won the Jimmy Watson, this wine probably sold in Australia for about $14. And I was in my final year of high school, studying economics, understood the concept of supply and demand, or thought I did pretty well. And I remember talking to mum and dad and just saying, Mum, why are you selling this wine for $14 when you could get $50 for it and people would buy it? And Dad sort of looked at me and he said, well, people would buy it. We might not sell another bottle of Cabernet next year though, unless the wine wins the award again. And he looked at me, and it's a lesson I've never forgotten. And it's a lesson I think that many producers actually have forgotten, that if you look after your customers will look after you. And it's that same concept that the Katina was talking about. Yeah, I don't like working that hard. I'm in this for the lifestyle. But people know with Elderton, certainly here in Australia, and over the 25 or so years we've been selling wine in the United States, that they can trust this. They can trust this bottle of wine. If it's not good enough, it doesn't go in the bottle, and it will always be value for money.
We talked to Marco Del Forno from Del Forno Romano, who makes incredible Amarone.
Yep.
His father was at Giuseppe Quintarelli's office with his wines for Mr. Quintarelli to taste when the U.S. importer for Quintarelli came to visit Giuseppe Quintarelli, and he tasted Romano Del Forno's first ever vintage, and said, "I don't care how much you made it, and I don't care how much it costs, I'll buy it all." So he sold his entire production in his first vintage, 1984, to the U.S. importer for Quintarelli. The next year, he was at Mr. Quintarelli's office again when the U.S. importer came by, and he tasted his second vintage. He tasted the second vintage of Del Forno Romano and said the same thing: "I don't care how much you made it, I don't care how much it costs, I'll buy it all." And Romano Del Forno said, "You can't have any. I'm not gonna sell this wine. I'm gonna sell it off for vinegar because it's not good enough."
Yeah.
And if I ruin my reputation with my second vintage, I will never recover from that. It will ruin me for forever, because people won't be able to feel like they can trust my wines. And then in his fourth vintage, 1987, he won Tre Bicchieri from Gambaro Rosso, which is kind of the ultimate. It's kind of like you winning the Jimmy Watson Trophy. It's kind of the same thing. In his fourth vintage, he won the greatest accolade you can get as an Italian winemaker. After 2 years earlier, he sold off his wine as alcohol for vinegar.
Yeah.
Imagine doing that. Imagine doing that.
No, exactly. Well, we made that. My brother and I made that decision in 2011.
Uh-oh.
We've lost you again, Allister.
We can all do this when we've lost his audio. Then he'll know.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Exactly.
There you go. Got you back.
I think I'm back. So yeah, we had a similar story in 2011 where it was the last tough vintage we've ever seen. Hopefully the toughest vintage I'll ever see. And talking to the legends of the Barossa, the last time we saw a harvest like this was 1973. So in my thinking, the next time it happens, it'll be my daughter's problem and not mine, hopefully. But it rained and rained and rained, and we'll never complain about the rain. But we almost picked in rowboats, and there was lots of mildew. And my brother and I looked at all those wines and all of our red wines, and we said, we're not releasing any of these. And we made that decision in about 10 minutes. We'd sold them off as in bulk, and took a huge financial loss that year. But the respect we've been given for having the credentials to do the right thing has been remarkable. And then, of course, we followed straight on with the 2012 wines, which was a remarkable vintage in the Barossa. And sometimes you've got to make the really tough calls to enable you to really go forward. And we'll continue to make those calls as well. We've got 40 years of history, and we're not going to stuff that up.
Christian Moreau told us that in 2018, if he'd vinified his Lake Clos, Grand Cru Chablis Lake Clos dry, it would have been 15% alcohol. So he sold it off as bulk juice because he didn't want to bottle it. He didn't want, again, ruin his reputation by bottling a Grand Cru Chablis that was 15% alcohol, because that's not what Chablis is. And the financial impact of not making a Grand Cru Chablis is, I mean, we're not talking about $25 a bottle. So you mentioned your daughter. You have 3 daughters and your brother has 3 sons.
Exactly.
How crazy is that?
It is quite crazy. And at this point, I'm still happy that I've very much got girls, but my oldest is 15, and so that might change soon.
Does she hate you
Well,
yet?
I only have a son.
She's,
I didn't
she's,
have to live
no,
through
she's
that.
not.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
You pretty much pursued a career in wine. Your brother went off and did a lot of other things, but then came back. How old were you when you knew you wanted to be a winemaker and not something else?
So the rule at Elderton, and it will follow through with the next generation, is that coming back to Elderton is not a birthright. You have to leave before you come back, and when you leave, you have to be educated. You have to go out and work in other places, and you need to have a skill to bring back to Elderton that will make Elderton better. And so I didn't know really too much of what I wanted to do. My brother knew exactly what he wanted to do. He wanted to make lots of money. He studied commerce, went straight into banking and finance, worked in Sydney, London and Munich for 14 or 15 years before he came home. But I did a commerce degree because I had no idea what I wanted to do. And after not really studying very hard and failing most things in my first year of college, I decided the wine industry was a perfect place for me to end up. And so I sat down with mum and dad at the time, and we mapped out a apprenticeship, if you will, to get my degree, to work in wineries and travel the world, to work in wholesale sales. But I knew pretty much when I was 18 that that's what I was working towards. I think my brother took it until he was probably 30 or so. But my return home was unfortunately sped up by the early passing of my father, who passed away in 1997. And so mum continued running the business, knowing that I was super keen to come home and sort of racing through an apprenticeship, hoping my brother would come home eventually, which he did. And I came home pretty much at the end of 1999 to lend a hand.
And the apprenticeship was at St. Superi?
One of the places. It's certainly, I think, one of the places where I learned the most, and I was really opened up to the world of wine.
Your mother's still actively involved in running the winery, is that correct?
She, we call her the Uber boss. So effectively, she handed us the keys in 2003. She said, "I've done this for you. I've spent money on your education. I trust you, and I know you're going to do a good job." So she pretty much leaves it up to us, but she still lives on the property. She's probably out the back doing some gardening at the moment. We say that she's our head gardener as well, because she just can't face the fact that the house that we grew up in, the house that she loved, is now our tasting room, and she thinks it has to look perfect for anyone that comes in. She's just that sort of person. But she very much hates the spotlight and isn't interested in I guess all that work that's involved in it now, and neither should she. She's had her time. She's in remarkable health. She still loves a drink and a laugh, and she should enjoy that, as I hope I can when I get to that age with 3 daughters taking over.
Would you tell the story of the label? I think this is pretty funny. Will you tell the story of the label for Eau de Lorraine?
Yeah. So we have a Cabernet, Shiraz and Merlot blend, which mum and dad actually made in 1992 to try and win the Jimmy Watson. It didn't, but our straight Cabernet won it. So we've sort of fallen in love with it. But when I first came back to Elderton, knowing that mum and dad were a 50-50 partnership, but dad having got all the accolades because he was the front man, I said to mum, "I think that the world deserves to know what you've done here at Elderton. So let us make a wine and name it after you." And she said, "No chance." So my brother came back into the business 3 or 4 years later. Mum's 60th birthday was coming up, and we decided that we would do it in secret and rename one of the wines in our portfolio after mum and unveil it at a huge surprise 60th birthday party that was coming up. A couple of months before the party that was planned in the house I'm in now, mum came up to my brother Cameron and I and said, "Listen, boys, I think you're up to something." She said, "I want you to know I don't celebrate my birthday anymore. I don't think it's a good thing that I'm another year older. And she said, if you throw me a party, I'm going to write you out of my will. And we said, Mum, no party, but you've never spent $1 on yourself. It's a marquee birthday and it's time to enjoy it. So if you don't organize something that's absolutely remarkable, we're going to throw you a party. And so a few days later, she said, I've organized with a good friend. We're going to go to New York for my birthday, spend a couple of weeks walking the streets and neighborhoods in Manhattan and just enjoy ourselves. And we gave her a blessing. We said, we'll also organize and pay for your birthday dinner. And so we sent her and her good friend Leslie Ann along to a restaurant called Jean Georges. So a 3 Michelin star restaurant in Manhattan. The girls went in. Meryl Streep was dining in the restaurant that night, which got them very excited. The Som came over, took them through the wine list, and Mum wanted to try some American wines because unfortunately we don't really see too many of them here in Australia. He pushed her towards a Chardonnay from a producer in Oregon, and then instead of providing that bottle, he came back to the table with the first ever bottle of the Ode to Lorraine, presented it to Mum and said, perhaps you'd rather drink this. Happy birthday, Lorraine. And as you can imagine, tears and laughter. 10 minutes later, there was a little bit of anger. One, that we'd done this to her, and secondly, because she still really wanted that bottle of Chardonnay that she'd asked for. So I had to call to get that back, basically. But it's a remarkable tribute to an amazing woman, a lady that has been through absolutely all sorts of terrible things in her life, but continues keeping on with a pretty remarkable smile on her face.
What was the Oregon Chardonnay?
I don't know. Again, she did call for it and get it back. She rang us that night and she was quite boozy and said, I love you boys. Please tell me that you only made one bottle of that wine, to which we said no. But by the time she'd got back to Australia, she couldn't remember it.
Well, she certainly picked a great restaurant to celebrate her birthday.
Yeah, exactly.
Jean Georges.
I have one more quick question I wanted to ask before we move on to the command. On the estate Cabernet, is it 100% French oak? Because I know in the command, I believe there's a little bit of American oak. Is that correct?
There is. It is predominantly French oak. So it used to be, this wine when it won the Jimmy Watson Trophy would have been 100% American oak. But now that we're using more French oak in some of our top bottlings, we can use old French oak with Cabernet, which we think works well. I don't know whether you guys can hear this, but my gardener is outside with a blower.
Can't hear it.
Can't hear it yet. He is a remarkable man. He finds me wherever I am, whenever I'm on a telephone or wherever I'm Zooming. He gets his blower and he finds where I am. It's an uncanny knack that he has.
Lorraine puts him up to it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, no, he's an amazing gardener, but he loves his blower. And I actually think that for us, Cabernet and French oak are built very well to go together. I like sort of the American terminology that Cabernet is that donut wine, where it has lots of flavor at the beginning and lots of flavor at the end and a little bit of a hole in the middle. And actually what French oak does to Cabernet is, because it's more fine-grained and goes sort of down the middle of your tongue, rather than American oak, which is broader and sweeter, it actually fills that hole in Cabernet really, really well. So which is why we're more than happy to use the older Cabernet, the older French oak barrels for this wine.
All right, great. Should we move on to the command, Hoyt?
Yeah,
We should.
I couldn't control myself. I've already tasted it. You know, I don't want to use profanity, but I'm tempted to say something inappropriate because honestly, this is a really, really extraordinary wine.
Thank you.
I agree with you.
Honestly, it is an especially now, 7 years old. We're tasting the 2014.
Yep.
7 years old. so I'll go on. I was going to say this a little bit later, but so I went on, let's see, let me start over. I think in a lot of parts of the world, there are kind of two wineries. So in Burgundy, there's DRC and Loire. In the Rhone Valley, there's Beaucastel and Bigot. In in the Mosel, there's Donhoff and JJ Prune. In Champagne, there's Salon and Krug, etc. You could go on. Maybe in Napa, maybe there's Harlan and Colgan. In Australian red wine, that equivalent, I guess, the obvious thing is Grange and Hill of Grace are the pillars of excellence for Australian red wine. But I went on just for this purpose. I don't really like to talk about scores in these conversations because I think the purpose of the conversation is for people to taste the wines and form their own judgments. But just for the sake of this argument today, I went on the Wine Advocate's website and I just entered Penfolds Grange. And I looked down at all the scores over the course of the years that Robert Parker and other people have written about Grange for the Wine Advocate. And then I did the same thing on the Hill of Grace. The average score for your Command Shiraz is higher than the average score for either of those wines.
Yeah, wow. I wouldn't have guessed that.
In the case of Hill of Grace, it's dramatically higher. Now, you haven't gotten any 100-point scores, but you've gotten a whole lot of 96, 97, and 98-point scores. And Grange got an 84, and Hill of Grace got an 88, and your lowest score is 92. For whatever that means, I don't want to belabor the point.
Means the wines are damn good.
But here's what I'm really, I asked, we had one of these conversations with Jeremy Sayce from Dujac and Trienne. And I said, why is it that your best wine sells for $475 a bottle and your competitor's best wine sells for $7,000 a bottle? His wine is not 15 times better than yours. And he just laughed at me. Because in his opinion, DRC, Romanée-Conti is 15 times better than his Chambertin.
Yeah, wow.
So how do you feel about that? Why is Command Shiraz $90 and Grange is $800?
I think, Grange is $800. It has a remarkable history. It is the wine of Australia. I don't believe in a lot of the winemaking that's behind it in terms of being cross-regional blending and a few other things, but that's the wine that opened up the doors to the whole world for Australian wine, and so it deserves its merits. As to its price, I've been lucky enough in my life to drink a lot of Grange. I've been in lots of situations where there's been open bottles. I've only ever bought one bottle of Grange in my life, and I can say with a lot of surety that Grange tastes a whole lot better when someone else pays for the bottle. And that is the absolute truth. I don't begrudge them, and I said this to Peter Gago. I said, your $800, it may seem expensive, but I get 15 emails a week offering me $1,000 bottles of wine of tiny little Burgundian producers and other people that I've never really heard of. I don't begrudge them of that success. I think Elderton's point of difference, though, is it's not always about that. It's about putting a smile on people's faces, and we live well. We're comfortable, but I don't like the concept that because you get a 99-point score, you double your price or you do anything like that. We have to go up every now and again just to cover all the increasing costs, etc. But Again, it goes back to the concept of you look after your customers look after you. And as I said, we're right next door to Penfolds, so people can actually walk between our two tasting rooms quite comfortably. And you can go to Penfolds and you can pay a lot of money to try Grange. And constantly we have people walking through our front doors with sort of looking completely starstruck and bewildered. And you instantly know that they've been at Penfolds and they've paid $100 to try Grange or whatever it costs. And you go, you just tried Grange, and they go, and you go, and you thought you were going to see a glass of wine that showed $800 worth of value, and they go, and I mean, it's wine, it's amazing wine, but all that price comes down to is whether you have $800 in your wallet that you can afford to pay for it. It doesn't mean it's the greatest product. It probably means you have a remarkable life experience. If you're that passionate about wine, it's worth it. But if $800 is too much to pay for a bottle of wine, don't pay that for it, because there's so many good $100 bottles or $50 bottles or $23 bottles, right, as we saw today. And so for us, I mean, I have ultimate respect for the Henschke family. Stephen himself comes across the room to say hello to me. He always tells me how much he misses my dad, how much Dad taught him about wine, which is a pretty remarkable concept. I have ultimate respect for Penfolds, and so when I was invited to that tasting last week with Peter Gago, I jumped at the opportunity. But we're pretty steadfast in what we do here at Elderton, and that we are on the right track.
Well, don't you think that the Elderton command, the reason that it is consistently a wonderful, I mean, it's just such a great wine, that it's two things going for it. It's a single block, and that the vines are over 120 years old. Yeah. And where that's completely different from the Penfolds. And I don't even want to compare Elderton to Penfolds, because to me, it's a different animal. So I really think it's because the vineyards, the vines are 120 years old, and it's a single block. And it's consistent every year, single year.
You'll see vintage variation, but you'll know that if you put all these things side by side, you'll be looking at a group of brothers, or in my case, a group of sisters. That block is remarkable, and the concept that a vineyard can live there for 127 years is remarkable in itself, let alone everything that it's been through. Old vines, they have root systems that go further down into the earth. They naturally produce less. So what they lack in quantity, they make up for in quality. And certainly they round out the tougher vintages where they can find those water and minerals in tougher years, because their roots go so much further down. They also just have a knack of knowing what you want. Once you get them trained, they have a knack of knowing what you want them to do, which is something that the exuberance of youth often misses in vineyards and in children, as I've discovered. But it is a remarkable block, and something that we cherish and love being the custodians of.
So with the vines being that old, how many cases in a normal year are you making of just the command?
So it's actually a pretty big block, and I'd be interested to know if there is a larger 100-year-old vineyard anywhere. So we have the capacity in a normal year to make a few thousand cases. As I said, the last few, certainly 19 and 20, they have been about less than a quarter of that. So
David wanted me to ask a question for him. What is the classic Australian dish that pairs well with your Shiraz?
I was actually asked this the other day. I was doing a Zoom to Los Angeles, and the way I answered this was firstly with an apology, because every time I come to the States, and admittedly I haven't been able to come for quite some time, as we all know, but every time I'm in America, being an Australian, I always get credits for the barbecuing that we do here in Australia. And it's sort of a little bit embarrassing, because I actually think we Australians are a lot lazier than you guys in terms of doing barbecue properly. Yes, we have barbecues, but some of the setups I've seen on my travels across the United States in terms of barbecues have been amazing, and the people that spend days in preparation and whatnot certainly puts us to shame. But we certainly have that outdoor lifestyle down pat. We have a weather that allows you to dine outside for a lot of the year, and so I think it's just that great piece of beef thrown on the barbecue, char broiled, as you guys would say, and with a nice glass of Shiraz. I mean, once you get into the depths of winters and you're talking about open fireplaces, it's all about slow braises with these Shirazes, whether it be lamb shanks or ossobuco or anything like that. I actually cooked brisket yesterday at home over about 7 or 8 hours. And I wasn't drinking yesterday, so but if I was, I would have thought Shiraz would have been the wine to go to. And if you're talking about finishing a meal, I just think a great piece of sort of English cheddar to go with Shiraz is pretty cool.
I would say
it does really well with tomato sauce or tomato-based dishes.
I think it can. Yeah. In terms of cooked tomato or fresh tomato, I'd probably say more cooked tomato personally, but yeah, exactly. No, I can cover that.
Okay.
I would say a porterhouse or a ribeye, preferably bone-in, grilled.
What are those tomahawks?
And glazed
exactly.
with a really good balsamic vinegar and some really excellent blue cheese crumbled on top with this Shiraz would be pretty heavenly. Honestly, Allister, you know, I hate to, I try to be careful to wax rhapsodic about wines that I taste in these conversations, because I don't want to, you know, devalue the rhapsody when I taste a wine. But this wine is, it is a truly extraordinary wine. You should be very, very proud of this wine. It is, I mean, you know, it's only a few days ago I tasted a 2010 Domenico Clerico Barolo per Cristina. That's a pretty amazing bottle of wine, right?
It is.
I would say this is one of the best red wines I've tasted in a long time. You are to be congratulated for this extraordinary.
Thank you, Hoyt. And the thing I'd like to say about that wine is, I mean, our family's heart and soul is there. But the great thing about that wine is it's not pretending to be anything else other than remarkable old vine Barossa Shiraz. And these are wines that if anyone was thinking about studying their MW or their Master Sommelier accreditation, these are wines that are put in front of these guys to showcase what great Barossa is. The estate Shiraz, which we didn't try today, but the command from that top end of town, basically. And winemaking here is pretty simple. It's very traditional, and our concept is not to try and make the biggest, baddest, blackest, most alcoholic Shiraz, but it's actually to showcase this remarkable vineyard in a way that you don't have one sip and go, that's amazing, but that's enough. But it actually brings you back to finish the glass and finish the bottle, and maybe even think about opening another one. But it is something that our family, as I said, holds very dear to our heart. We love that vineyard. It deserves the credit over what the family deserves, but it is a very special part of the world.
Is it fair to say, well, it's a common thread in these conversations that the great wines, the intent of the winemaker is to express what makes the place where the grapes are grown special. We hear this constantly. Only mistakes are made in the wine cellar. You know, great wines are made in the vineyard, and if I just stay out of the way and let the wine make itself, it's gonna. If I've done my job in the vineyard, the wine will end up being something really special. But do you think it's? I mean, some wines are cerebral and intellectual, right? Like Grand Cru Burgundies are cerebral. Grand Cru Alsatian Riesling is cerebral, etc.
Yep.
This wine is hedonistic.
Yep.
Is that fair?
I think so. But I think I think what's often missed when people talk about, you were talking about all these great wines made in the vineyard, and I completely agree with it. But I think what's often missed is the fact that these vineyards are so remarkable that you can basically do, or I mean, you can stuff them up. But if you look at Command, for example, that goes to 100% new oak. 2/3 of that is American, 1/3 is French, and we'll always spend at least 30 months in barrel before it's bottled. And that shows how remarkable this vineyard is, that it can stand up to that as a concept, because I can tell you there are a number of vineyards that we own that if we did that too, the oak would tear the wine to shreds. Whereas with this, it comes out the other side looking fresh, looking bright. It ages remarkable. It stays in balance. And that's what that essence of an amazing vineyard is, that it can actually take the inputs that we put into it basically to make it even more remarkable. Barossa Shiraz is always hedonistic, to your point. It's one of the reasons why we've had major amounts of success globally, is that these wines are super easy to understand. The best descriptor I use for them, for Shiraz and the Barossa, it's just a wine that gives you a cuddle. It's easy to understand, puts a smile on your face. You don't have to age it if you don't want to. They jump out of the bottle upon release. And so it's, yeah, I mean, it's one of those things we can talk about all the intricacies, but at the end of the day, it's just there to hopefully put a smile on people's faces.
It's really damn sexy.
Thank you. Honestly.
Do you know Paul Brakovic?
Where's Paul from?
Kumeu River, New Zealand.
Yeah, so I've not met Paul, but I certainly know his wines.
So, you know, there aren't that many wineries that are all your wines in Stelvin?
So we certainly, pretty much everything is in Stelvin. About 95% of what we do is in Screwcap.
There aren't that many wineries that make wines of this caliber, other than Kumeu River and you, that everything's Stelvin. Yeah. And you know, it's almost with Kumeu River, it's almost like a political statement they're making, but they just feel, you know, I mean, so for how long have your wines had the Stelvin closure? So
with Command, we do a little bit in cork as well. My preference is certainly for screw caps for Stelvin. My brother's probably a bit of an old romantic that still likes corks. But we have been doing Command in Stelvin, or partly in Stelvin, since 2001. And my mother almost put that Jimmy Watson Cabernet from '92 in a screw cap bottle. They opted out right at the last minute because they just thought there was a potential that would ruin the advantage that we were about to get. But had they done it back then, Elderton would have been up in the stratosphere here in Australia in terms of being that innovative, remarkable company that we sort of think we occasionally are. But here in Australia, it's very unusual to see wines in cork probably now. So a lot of those wines that you guys see from Australia in screw cap in America would probably be, I mean, in cork in America would be sealed with screw cap for Australian consumers.
Well, I just think if you need reinforcement that you should finish your wines with Stelvin, consider yourself reinforced.
Yeah.
You know, earlier this evening, I opened a bottle of Finger Lakes Riesling for the owner. And it's a fabulous wine. The bottle but it has a cork in it. The bottle I opened for him was tired and oxidized. I opened a second bottle and it was glorious. And you know, it's just, I mean, it's ridiculous that we put up with that.
It is. Screw cap isn't the perfect alternative. It just for us works better than cork, and certainly longer term works better than cork. I use the example, which is not fair, but when I'm doing wine dinners and I get asked about it, I say that there's no other industry in the world that puts up with a rate of failure like the wine industry does with cork. And I said, imagine if somewhere between 3 and 12% of airplanes didn't land on the runway. there wouldn't be too many people to get in an airplane, that's for sure. But forever and ever and ever, we've put up with it. And I love it when I get good corks, when I see them come out of a bottle. But at the end of the day, I'd much rather know that the wine that I have is in pretty remarkable shape, and I know that it's going to come out of the bottle the way that we intended it to look when we put it in the bottle.
I think there's a big misconception in the United States that Stelvin wines or screw cap are kind of like inexpensive, cheap wines when, and I think that's a real big misconception, but it's changing. People are changing on that. And I think the ratio of cork to Stelvin, you're not going to have corked wines. And the other thing is, I think that the majority of the consumers that are just average wine drinkers, if they were in a restaurant and got a corked bottle of wine that it was just a regular service, they wouldn't know it. They would have no idea that it was corked.
Well, in our conversation with Paul Brakovic, this was, I mean, they regularly do this. They taste 200 bottles with corks. And it's not just that some bottles are corked. It's that if they taste 200 bottles, 25 are corked.
Variation.
25 are really special. And then there's 150 that are okay. And
there's a lot of variation.
It's more, exactly, every bottle's, and I talked about this. You know, I used to be one of the sommeliers at the Wine Spectator Wine Experience. And one of your jobs as one of the sommeliers, they assign you a wine, you're supposed to taste 120 bottles of this wine. And that's an unusual experience to taste 120 bottles in a row of the same wine. It's not something that, you know, most people, even sommeliers, would do very often. In 120 bottles of the same wine, there's always 5 or 6 bottles that are really extraordinary, really stand out, are really special. There's probably 12 to 15 that are undrinkable or even more. And it's not just corked. It's light struck or oxidized or whatever the issue is. But there's probably, in 120 bottles, there's probably 15 that are corked. And then there's the ones and then every bottle's different. They're not just good and bad and undrinkable. Each one's different. Each bottle's different.
That's because wine is a living, breathing thing.
Right. So
I make the argument that there's a big difference between oxidation and maturation. So corks will allow oxygen in, but each cork is different. But oxidation is not how you age a wine. So with screw cap, where it's a more perfect seal, those wines still age, and we've seen that over 20 years of using it. They age slower because there isn't oxidation, but they age as the wine intended rather than as the cork allows it to.
Well, anyway, I applaud your decision to use Stelvin, and I applaud you for these 3 amazing wines.
I had this argument with Harvey Steinman when he was doing the Australian reviews. I probably had this argument with him 10 or 15 years ago. He said that from now on, they were going to score, which I don't think they ever did, but if they got a corked bottle of wine across their desk at the Wine Spectator of Australian wine, that they were going to score it as a corked bottle of wine and not ask for another bottle. And I said, that's unreasonable. I mean, regardless of whether we're in screw cap or not, which we were, I said, that's completely unreasonable. And he said, why? And I said, well, why are you doing it? And he said, well, everyone now accepts Australian wine in screw cap, so it should happen. And I said, well, under that concept, you should score every corked bottle of wine that comes across the Wine Spectator table as corked bottle of wine. And I'm actually doing a cork versus screw cap back vintage tasting here at Elderton next weekend. And I think it's exciting because I'm not even going to taste any of the wines before I pour them. And if they come out corked, so be it. This is the reason. It just shows why we as winemakers get frustrated and putting up with a product that we haven't really got the quality that we've paid for.
Okay, this is a private. Well, I can't tell that story. I'm sorry. This is going to go on YouTube, and then so in private, I'll tell you a Harvey Steinman story.
Yeah, okay. No, all good.
I might, Lord knows, I might
Well,
end up with a lawsuit if I told you that story. And
You could pause the recording, tell the story, and then start the recording again.
yeah, I can do
This
that.
is
I'll do that. That's a good idea. I'll do that.
A living, breathing thing. And I think it really kind of depends on the individual and what happens and what happened during your day and, you know, what you're feeling and all that kind of stuff. I truly believe that, being in this business as long as I have been, that's the way it is.
So Allister, I have one last question, and I usually end these conversations with this question. And I am not asking you what is the greatest wine you've ever tasted, because I know what that is. It's the 2014 Elderton Command Shiraz. But excuse me, Shiraz. I will always pronounce the word Shiraz when I talk about your wines from now on, I promise. But share with us a memorable wine experience from your life.
I think I'll talk to two, if I may. One probably was the first time that I tried the Seppeltsfield 100-year-old Paraliqueur port. So there is a winery here in the Barossa that started I think it started in the 1860s by a guy called Benno Seppelt. And he, in 1860, decided he was going to put a fortified away for 100 years before he released it, which is obviously the most ludicrous business plan of all time. And this is one of the reasons why I love wine, because there's so many of these ludicrous business plans. So his business plan was something that he wasn't going to see the benefit of, his kids weren't going to see the benefit of, and maybe his grandkids weren't going to see the benefit of. But they put this wine away. And is it the most pleasurable bottle of fortified wine I've ever had? Definitely not. But is it the most remarkable thing I've ever probably tasted? Absolutely. Similar cat when Bolo opened those really old Madeiras from the 1860s, wasn't it? 1850 something. I mean, that sort of stuff is just absolutely remarkable. The other thing, which is probably a little bit more fun and playful, is my experience of being holding one of the panels at the Hospice de Rhone, the event held in Paso Robles every year, where I was asked to host one of the 4 masterclasses that they have. And I thought I'll bring Richard, who was our winemaker at the time, along for a little bit of sort of chemistry support in case because there's obviously lots of winemakers that go to it, in case anyone asks technical questions that I don't know the answers to. And I thought I'll bring my brother along because it's a bloody good party and it's a great fun event. And anyway, they got there before me. They basically didn't wait for me at the airport, and I almost had to hitchhike from the San Luis Obispo airport to Paso Robles, and lucky enough met a guy that I'd met a few years ago when I went as a consumer to the event, who was the official photographer. And he said, I'll give you a lift, but he said, I've got to stop at Costco because I'm cooking a barbecue tonight. And I said, I've never been in a Costco. I'd love to see one. Walk in, and there was an entire pallet of Dom Perignon Champagne, 1996 vintage, for I think $92 a bottle.
Wow.
And I quickly did the maths in my head and went, yes, I'll be losing money if I don't buy 2 or 3 bottles of this right now. So bought 3 bottles, took them back to my hotel room in Paso. The first night, which was the night before our seminar, my brother discovered tequila for the first time in his life, which wasn't a good thing to do before having to host a seminar for 700 people. I sort of behaved myself, did most of the seminar, and there's lots of stories that I could get into that we don't have time for. But and I asked for the first seminar so we could get over and done with and have lots of fun afterwards, basically. And so the second night went out to dinner, had a great dinner. Went to I can't think of the restaurant, but as Californian liquor laws are, you get thrown out at 2 o'clock in the morning. And that's when I recognized that I had 3 bottles of great champagne in my room, and said to the 15 or so people, come back to my room, I've got champagne. Got back to the room and went, I have 2 wine glasses, I have 2 coffee cups, and I have 2 water glasses, and there's 16 of us. So we have to get inventive here. And I actually drank Dom Perignon out of the lid from my shaver cream that night. And we were very lucky not to get thrown out of that hotel. But again, it's one of those makeshift moments that you make do. And it always brings a smile to my face thinking about that, because Dom deserves so much better than that. But in that moment, it was the absolute best thing that we could come up with.
It's not only Dom Perignon, it's one of the greatest vintages ever for Dom Perignon.
I know. That's why I said I'd be losing money if I didn't buy it.
The 96 Dom Perignon that's the best wine they've ever made.
Yeah.
Well, maybe, I don't know, the 76, I guess, but
76 is pretty good too.
Anyway, it's one of the best vintages, one of the best as well. It's one of the best champagnes ever made.
Yeah,
Can we ask if anybody has any questions for Al before we end our evening? Anybody have anything that they want to ask?
It sure seems like we've covered everything.
Well,
Yeah.
I will say that there's one thing that we didn't talk about because we didn't have it tonight. But if any of you are dessert wine fans, Elderton makes a golden Semillon that is phenomenal. It's just incredible. We import it. We bring it into the States. You should try it because and it will last for decades. But it's just fantastic. And we have the command. We also the estate Shiraz and estate Cab, and then as Al mentioned before, with the E Series Chard, there's the E Series Shiraz and Cab. That's a great value as well. And then there are some special order things that we have. So if you're interested, let Hoyt know, and we can take care of you. But thanks. I just want to thank Hoyt and thank Al for joining us tonight, and Hoyt for putting this on. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. I want to thank all of you guys. You've been great friends to the Ashmead family for a long, long time. My brother and I both adore the United States, and we can't wait till this world gets healthy and we can come back and open some bottles and have some smiles and some laughs and some good times together. But hang in there, stay safe, keep drinking, and come and see us one day as well. But thank you for putting up with me today.
Well, thank you so much, Allister. Thank you for your time, and especially thank you for these amazing wines, these 3 amazing wines. It's been a pleasure.
Very much
Thank you
appreciate
so
all of your
much.
support.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone have a great night. Al, I'll talk to you soon. I hope to see you in Chicago soon.